wind howled across the Montana prairie, scraping brittle grass against the cabin's weathered logs like a mournful fiddle. Inside, silence reigned, thick as dust on the mantelpiece, holding a faded tintype of a woman's smile. 3 years. 3 years since laughter had warmed these walls. Then, cutting through the wind's dirge, it came, a knock. Not the heavy fist of trouble, but soft, hesitant, almost swallowed by the vast emptiness. It stirred the dust motes dancing in the single lantern's weak light, a sound forgotten, yet instantly recognized. Hope, perhaps. Or just another kind of storm, knocking. The knock echoed again, a fragile counterpoint to the wind's relentless whine. Silas Morgan lowered the worn leather strap he'd been oiling, the familiar scent suddenly sharp in the charged air. His hand, calloused and scarred from decades of rope and rein, hovered mid-air. Who? Nobody came out this far anymore, not since Martha. Not since the silence swallowed everything but the wind and his own circling thoughts. The ranch, the broken wheel, felt less like a home, and more like a monument to what was lost, perched on the edge of the vast indifferent Montana territory, 1878. He rose slowly, joints protesting like dry hinges. The single oil lantern cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to cling to the corners, reluctant to reveal the room's sparse furnishings, the rough-hewn table scarred by years of use, the cold stone hearth, the empty rocking chair by the window, where Martha used to sit and mend. He moved towards the heavy oak door, the floorboards groaning under his worn boots, each sound amplified in the stillness he'd cultivated. Dust motes, disturbed by his movement, swirled like tiny ghosts in the lantern light. Unlatching the heavy bolt, Silas pulled the door open just enough to see. The dying light of the setting sun painted the prairie in bruised hues of purple and orange, silhouetting 2 figures against the immense sky. A woman, slight but standing straight, despite an obvious weariness that seemed etched into her very bones. Her dress, once perhaps a serviceable calico, was faded and travel-stained, the hem caked with the fine pale dust that got everywhere. Beside her, half hidden behind the woman's skirts, stood a child. A girl, no more than 5 or 6, her wide eyes enormous in a small pale face framed by tangled brown hair escaping a faded bonnet. She clutched a ragged cloth doll tightly against her chest. The wind whipped strands of the woman's own dark wind-tossed hair across her face. She met Silas's guarded stare directly, though he saw the tremor in her hands where they gripped the handle of a battered carpetbag. Her eyes, a startling shade of hazel flecked with green, held a depth of exhaustion, but also a flinty core of determination. "Evenin', sir," she said, her voice low and raspy, like pebbles dragged over wood. It carried over the wind. "Name's Eleanor Vance. I was told." She paused, taking a shallow breath. "I was told you might be in need of a cook." Silas didn't move, his frame filling the doorway. Need? He barely remembered what he needed beyond the basic mechanics of survival. Food was fuel, tasteless and functional, prepared by his own indifferent hands over the hearth or on a campfire outside. The idea of someone else in Martha's kitchen, touching her pots, stirring at her stove, a cold knot tightened in his chest. He scanned the empty horizon behind them. No wagon, no horse tethered nearby that he could see. Just 2 lone figures, and the immense swallowing prairie. How had they gotten here? On foot? It was miles to the nearest settlement. Told by who? Silas asked, his voice a gravelly rumble, unused to conversation. He kept his gaze steady, assessing. She looked capable, he supposed, beneath the layers of dust and fatigue. But capable of what? Eleanor's gaze flickered away for a fraction of a second, towards the darkening eastern horizon, then back to him. "Folks back down at Bitter Creek," she said, a little too quickly. "Heard tell the broken wheel needed steady hands." Said the owner was. She hesitated, searching for the right word that wouldn't offend. "Managing alone." Silas grunted, non-committal. Bitter Creek was a wide spot in the trail, 20 hard miles south. Gossip traveled. But why would it travel about him? He was a ghost haunting his own land. His eyes drifted past Eleanor, drawn irresistibly to the small figure clinging to her mother. The girl stared back at him, with unnerving directness. Her eyes weren't frightened, just deeply curious, taking in his weathered face, his thick mustache, the scar above his eyebrow. There was an innocence in that gaze, untouched by the harshness etched into her mother's features and his own. A fragile thing, like a wild flower, pushing through cracked earth. Silas found himself shifting his stance, unconsciously making his looming presence less intimidating. The cold knot in his chest didn't dissolve, but something else stirred beneath it, unfamiliar and disconcerting. Pity? A long-buried echo of something else. He cleared his throat. Bitter Creek's a fair piece. You walked, some, Eleanor admitted, her knuckles white on the bag handle, caught a ride part way with a freighter heading north. He let us off at the turnoff. She didn't elaborate on the miles they must have covered since then. Her gaze swept past him, taking in the dim interior of the cabin, the cold hearth, the single plate on the table, the profound isolation. We're hard workers, sir, me and Abigail. She gently touched her daughter's shoulder. I can cook, clean, tend a garden, if there's one. Abby's quiet, no trouble. Abigail, emboldened by her mother's touch, or perhaps just too tired for fear, took a tiny half-step forward. Her gaze was fixed on the rough wooden table inside, visible past Silas's legs. Mama, she whispered, her voice a small chime in the wind. I'm awful hungry. The simple plaintive statement hung in the air. It wasn't a demand, just a child's exhausted truth. Silas looked down at the small face tilted up to his, the vulnerability stark in the fading light. He remembered another small voice, silenced forever. The memory was a physical ache, sharp and sudden. He hadn't fed a child in 3 years, hadn't considered the needs of anyone but himself and the few surviving cattle. The wind moaned around the cabin corner. Eleanor watched him, her face carefully neutral, but Silas saw the desperate hope warring with the fear of rejection in her eyes. She was running from something, that much was clear. Bitter Creek gossip didn't send women with children walking miles across open range on a rumor. Who was she hiding from? Or what? He stepped back, pulling the door wider. The movement felt stiff, unnatural. The lantern light spilled out onto the rough porch planks. Cold out here, he said gruffly, avoiding Eleanor's eyes, and looking instead at the top of Abigail's dusty head. Best come in. Got beans on the hearth. Ain't fancy. Relief washed over Eleanor's face so profound it momentarily erased the lines of weariness. Thank you, sir. Thank you kindly. She ushered Abigail gently ahead of her. As the child stepped over the threshold, brushing past Silas's legs, he caught a faint scent, sun-warmed dust, dry grass, and something indefinably young and alive. It was a scent utterly alien to the cabin's atmosphere of dust and old grief. As Eleanor followed, her eyes darted around the shadowed room, lingering for a heartbeat on the empty rocking chair and the tintype on the mantel. Her gaze wasn't just assessing the space, it held a flicker of recognition, a sadness that mirrored his own. Then, as she turned to close the door against the encroaching night, Silas saw it. Her hand, brushing her skirt, briefly touched a small tarnished silver locket pinned beneath her collar. It was an oddly delicate thing against the rough fabric, but it was the fleeting, haunted glance she cast back out into the deepening twilight, towards the empty east, that truly sent a cold prickle down Silas's spine. Whoever had told her the broken wheel needed a cook hadn't just sent help, they'd sent trouble. The cabin door clicked shut, sealing them in a fragile pocket of light against the vast Montana night. The wind's howl became a muffled complaint against the thick logs. Abigail pressed closer to her mother's legs, her wide eyes scanning the shadowed room, the rough-hewn table, the cold stone hearth, the looming silhouette of Silas Morgan. Dust motes danced in the lantern light like trapped spirits. Silas gestured awkwardly towards the hearth. Beans there, he mumbled, the words feeling thick and clumsy. Pots still warm. He busied himself relighting the lantern wick, its flame sputtering then steadying, casting deeper shadows on his weathered face. The presence of others, especially a child, felt like an intrusion into the carefully curated tomb of his solitude. Martha's absence, always a heavy cloak, now felt suffocatingly close. He could almost see her in the rocking chair, hear the soft scrape of her knitting needles. Eleanor moved with quiet purpose, shedding the weariness like a physical weight, now that shelter was found. She guided Abigail towards the hearth. Sit here, Abby, where it's warm, she said softly, her voice regaining a touch of steadiness. She spotted the dented tin pot nestled in the embers. Lifting it with a corner of her skirt to protect her hands, she placed it on the table. The simple, familiar scent of simmered beans, usually just fuel, now seemed inadequate. She glanced at Silas, then back at the pot. "Mind if I doctor these up a mite, Mr. Morgan?" Saw some wild onions by the creek bend coming in. Silas grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. He watched her unpack a small bundle tied to her carpet bag, a worn cloth holding a few precious items, a stub of tallow candle, a twist of salt wrapped in paper, and 3 small pungent wild onions. Her movements were economical, practiced. She found a chipped plate for Abigail, and scooped a modest portion of beans onto it. "Blow on it, sweetheart," she murmured, handing it to the child. Abigail, hunger overriding shyness, perched on the hearthstones, and began blowing diligently on the steaming food. As Abigail ate, small, careful spoonfuls, Eleanor took the knife Silas wordlessly offered, and began finely chopping the onions. The sharp, clean scent cut through the cabin's stale air of dust and grief. She scraped them into the bean pot, added a pinch of salt from her twist, and gave it a stir. The aroma transformed instantly, becoming richer, homelier. Silas found himself leaning against the doorframe, drawn by the unfamiliar domesticity. He hadn't smelled cooking like that in 3 years. It wasn't Martha's cooking, but it was alive. His gaze drifted to Abigail. The child, momentarily absorbed in her meal, had noticed something on a low shelf near the hearth. Her small hand reached out, hesitantly, towards a folded square of faded blue fabric tucked beside a stack of kindling. It was Martha's shawl, the soft wool one she'd worn against the evening chill. Silas hadn't moved it, couldn't bear to put it away. His breath hitched, a silent protest forming. But Abigail's touch was feather light, just the tips of her fingers brushing the worn wool. She didn't pick it up, she simply touched it, a look of quiet wonder on her face, as if sensing the echo of tenderness it held. Silas watched, the cold knot in his chest twisting, not entirely with pain now, but with a bewildering ache of something lost and something glimpsed. The innocence of that touch, so different from his own crushing grief, unsettled him deeply. Eleanor, stirring the beans, followed his gaze. Her eyes softened as she saw her daughter touching the shawl, then flickered to Silas's rigid posture, the stark pain etched around his eyes. "Abby," she said gently, but not sharply. "That's Mr. Morgan's." The child snatched her hand back, looking contrite. "It's fine," Silas rasped, the words surprising him. He cleared his throat. "Just cloth." He pushed away from the doorframe, needing distance. He moved to the small window, peering out into the moon-washed prairie, a landscape of silver and deep indigo shadows. The vast emptiness usually mirrored his soul. Tonight it felt different. Contained within these log walls was a fragile warmth, a flickering light he hadn't asked for. He turned back. Eleanor was dishing beans into 2 chipped bowls. She handed one to him. Their fingers didn't touch, but the warmth of the bowl seeped into his chilled hands. "Thank you," he said, the courtesy rusty on his tongue. He took a spoonful. The beans were simple, but the onions and salt lifted them beyond mere sustenance. It tasted like care. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. They ate in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Abigail's soft chewing. Eleanor ate sparingly, her eyes constantly flicking to the window, then to the door, listening intently beyond the wind. The haunted look Silas had glimpsed earlier hadn't vanished. It was merely banked like embers waiting for a breath of air. "Long way from Bitter Creek," Silas ventured, watching her over the rim of his bowl. He kept his tone neutral. Eleanor nodded, stirring her beans without eating much. "It is," she agreed quietly. "Needed a fresh start." She didn't elaborate. Her free hand drifted unconsciously to her throat, where the tarnished silver locket lay hidden beneath her collar. It was a fleeting gesture, almost protective. "Man at the livery in Bitter Creek." Silas pressed gently, remembering her earlier claim. "Who pointed you my way?" He tried to recall faces from his infrequent trips, blurred by time and disinterest. Eleanor's spoon stilled. Her eyes met his, a flicker of panic quickly masked by weariness. "Oh, just one of the fellows there," she said vaguely, looking down at her bowl. Didn't catch his name proper. Big fella, beard. Her description was generic, fitting half the men in the territory. She took a small deliberate bite, signaling the end of that line of inquiry. The beans are good, Mr. Morgan. Thank you for sharing. Silas let it drop, but the seed of doubt, planted when she'd glanced eastward, took root. Her evasiveness was a palpable thing, thickening the air. Who was she hiding from? Why spin a thin story about Bitter Creek? He finished his beans, the warmth in his belly suddenly tempered by a chill of unease. This woman brought life. Yes, a tantalizing warmth he'd forgotten, but she also brought a shadow. What kind of storm had he invited inside? Eleanor stood, gathering the empty bowls. We'll clean up, Mr. Morgan. Then we can bed down in the barn, if it's sound. Don't want to impose in your house. Silas started to nod, the barn being the obvious, detached solution, when a sound cut through the wind's constant moan. Not the cry of a coyote, or the rustle of sage. It was distant, rhythmic, muffled by the vastness, yet unmistakable. Thud, 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 hoof beats. Not the scattered gait of a lone rider, but the purposeful, steady cadence of several horses moving together. Somewhere out there on the moonlit prairie, riding hard, heading west, or riding towards the broken wheel. Silas froze, his eyes locking with Eleanor's across the dimly lit room. All the color drained from her face, leaving her features stark with a terror that was far too deep, far too personal, to be just a stranger's fear of nighttime visitors. Her hand flew to her throat again, gripping the hidden locket like a talisman. The fragile warmth of the cabin vanished, replaced by the icy grip of the unknown, galloping closer in the dark. The rhythmic thud-thud of the hoofbeats froze the air inside the cabin tighter than a hangman's knot. Silas Morgan's hand instinctively dropped to the worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, his body coiled, every sense straining beyond the log walls. Across the dim room, Eleanor Vance stood rigid, the empty bowls forgotten in her hands. The raw terror etching her face in the flickering lantern light was a stark, silent confession. This wasn't random night riders, this was the shadow she'd been fleeing, now pounding across the prairie towards them. Abigail, sensing the sudden icy shift, whimpered softly, scrambling from the hearthstones to bury her face against her mother's dusty skirts. "It's all right, Abby," Eleanor whispered, her voice thin and trembling despite the reassurance. She set the bowls down with a clatter, her movements jerky. Her hand, pale and shaking, pressed hard against her throat, undoubtedly clutching the hidden locket beneath the fabric. Just riders passing by. The lie was flimsy, transparent even to the child. Silas moved to the small grimy window beside the door, pressing himself flat against the wall. He eased the latch open just enough to peer through a narrow crack. The moon, nearly full, cast a cold, silvery light over the vast expanse of the broken wheel. The prairie stretched out, an ocean of bleached grass and sagebrush rolling to distant dark hills. And there, perhaps half a mile to the east, where the trail from Bitter Creek crested a low rise, he saw them. 3 riders, maybe 4, silhouetted starkly against the moonlit sky. They'd stopped. Lanterns were unshuttered, casting wobbling circles of yellow light that swept slowly across the ground like searching eyes. They weren't moving on. They were looking, scanning the terrain. Silas's gut clenched. The broken wheel wasn't on any main trail. Nobody stopped here unless they meant to. "See anything?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible, strained with dread. "Riders," Silas confirmed, his voice low and gravelly. "Stopped on the east ridge. Got lanterns out. Lookin'." He didn't turn, keeping his eye pressed to the crack. He heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of her skirts as she knelt, gathering Abigail closer. Silas knew isolation was his only defense. No neighbors for miles, no law but what a man made for himself. His gaze swept the nearer yard, the empty corral, the sagging barn door, the dark hulk of the woodpile. Nothing moved but the wind-stirred grass. He glanced back at Eleanor, crouched on the dirt floor, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. The child's wide, frightened eyes peered over her mother's shoulder. That look, the vulnerability, struck a chord deeper than suspicion. It echoed a loss carved into his own bones. He remembered Martha, fever-bright eyes in their bed, whispering promises he couldn't keep. Remembered the small grave under the lone cottonwood. Protecting this woman and her child felt suddenly terrifyingly necessary, a duty resurrected from the ashes of his own grief. But protection required trust, and trust was a currency he hadn't dealt in for years. "Eleanor," he said, still watching the distant lights. "Who are they?" The question hung heavy, demanding. He heard her shift, felt the weight of her hesitation. "I don't know for certain," she stammered, the evasion clear. "Men who want something that isn't theirs to take." Her voice dropped even lower. "My husband, he owed debts. Bad men. When he passed, they came for me, for what they claimed was owed." There was a brittle edge to her words, a story half told, glossing over the worst of it. Why would debt riders chase a woman and child this far into the wilderness? It didn't fully ring true. The distant lanterns began to move, not west along the trail, but slowly, deliberately, angling south, skirting the ridge, circling, searching for a way down into the shallow draw that led towards the ranch buildings. Silas's jaw tightened. He needed a better vantage point. "Stay low, keep the lantern shuttered," he ordered, his voice taut. He moved away from the window, grabbing his worn sheepskin coat and his long-barreled Sharps rifle leaning by the door. The heavy weight of the rifle was familiar, a grim comfort. He glanced at Eleanor, fear warred with a desperate hope in her eyes. "Barn loft. I can see clearer." He cracked the door just enough to slip out, the cold night air biting his face after the cabin's stuffy warmth. The wind snatched at his coat, carrying the faint acrid scent of sage and dust. He moved swiftly, keeping to the deeper shadows along the cabin wall, then darted across the open yard towards the larger, darker shape of the sod-roofed barn. The moon cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for him. Inside the barn, the familiar smells of dry hay, old manure, and leather enveloped him. He climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft, the worn wood groaning under his weight. At the small open hay door facing east, he crouched, resting the barrel of the Sharps on the rough sill. The moonlight was bright enough to see clearly. The riders were still moving south along the ridge, their lantern beams sweeping methodically back and forth. They were definitely searching, scanning the draw below, the approach to the ranch. Silas scanned the moonlit yard, the corral, the path to the creek. His eyes caught on something near the corner of the cabin, just outside the circle of weak light spilling from the shuttered window. Something small and pale lay on the hard-packed dirt. It hadn't been there when he'd gone out to meet Eleanor at the door. Had it fallen from her bag, or been left deliberately? He squinted. It looked like a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a smooth, dark river stone. Someone had been here, close. While they were inside, tense and listening, someone had crept right up to the cabin door. The cold prickle on his spine intensified. Who? And why leave a note instead of just knocking, or worse? The distant riders continued their slow, ominous patrol along the ridge, their lights bobbing like malevolent fireflies. But the immediate threat felt suddenly closer, more intimate. That scrap of paper lying in the dirt pulsed with silent, unanswered danger. Silas stared at it, the Sharps forgotten for a moment, a new and chilling layer of mystery settling over the broken wheel. The scrap of paper beneath the river stone pulsed in Silas Morgan's vision like a wound. The distant riders, their lanterns still bobbing along the southern ridge, faded momentarily into the background noise of his racing thoughts. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the cabin door while they huddled inside, hearts pounding. It felt like a violation, a chilling counterpoint to the overt threat circling the perimeter. Silas scanned the moonlit yard again, the Sharps rifle held ready. Nothing moved but the wind-tossed grass. The barn, the corral, the woodpile, all lay still under the cold silver light. Whoever left the note was gone now, a ghost in the Montana night. But why leave it? A warning, a trap? He couldn't leave it lying there. Taking a final hard look towards the ridge, the riders seemed to be pausing, their lights holding steady. Silas descended the loft ladder with practiced quiet. Inside the barn, the familiar sense of hay and leather offered no comfort now. He moved swiftly to the barn door, cracked it open, and scanned the open ground between him and the cabin corner. Clear, he darted across the hard-packed dirt, keeping low, the cold night air biting through his coat. He snatched the paper, the smooth, cold river stone, and was back in the barn's deeper shadows in 3 long strides, heart hammering against his ribs. Back inside the relative safety of the barn, he leaned against the rough stall partition, catching his breath. The paper was coarse, like packing paper, folded small and square. He unfolded it carefully. The moonlight slanting through the open hayloft door was faint, but enough. The writing was in ink, a hurried, masculine scrawl, stark against the pale surface. Silas, he's coming for her. Franklin's men, get them clear. Silas stared. Silas, the writer knew his name. He's coming for her. Franklin's men. The name Franklin meant nothing to him, but the intent was chillingly clear. Get them cleared. A warning, not a threat. But from who? J. The initial sparked nothing. Jonas, Jacob, he knew no one by those names close enough to risk this. The handwriting wasn't familiar either. A jagged, urgent script. Franklin. Eleanor had mentioned debts, bad men coming after her when her husband died. Was Franklin the creditor, or something worse? Why send multiple riders this deep into territory for a widow's debt? The story felt flimsier by the minute, a thin veil over something darker. He pocketed the note and the stone, the cold weight of the river rock a tangible reminder of the unseen messenger. He needed to confront Eleanor, now. The fragile trust he'd started to extend was cracking under the weight of secrets and circling danger. He slipped back into the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor was sitting on the floor near the hearth, her back against the stones, Abigail curled asleep in her lap, wrapped tightly in Martha's faded blue shawl. The sight of the child enveloped in that familiar wool, a symbol of his own lost comfort now offering solace to another, struck Silas with a confusing pang. Eleanor looked up, her face pale and drawn in the single lantern's low glow, eyes wide with unspoken questions. Silas held up the folded paper. Found this, outside, under a stone. His voice was low, gravelly. Says Silas, he's coming for her. Franklin's men, get them clear. Eleanor's breath hitched audibly. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers digging into the fabric where the locket lay hidden. All color drained from her face, leaving her looking ghostly. Franklin, the name clearly meant something terrible. Who's J? Silas pressed, stepping closer, keeping his voice down for Abigail's sake, but letting the steel show. Who left this? And who the hell is Franklin? You said debts. This sounds like a manhunt. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, a tremor running through her. When she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears and raw fear. Franklin, she whispered, the name sounding like poison. He was my husband's brother. She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking to the sleeping child. Not debts, Mr. Morgan, not really. My husband, Silas. He found something. On their land. Gold, maybe. Franklin, he wanted it. Argued. Things got bad. My husband died. An accident, they said. Her voice broke on the lie. But Franklin knew Silas had told me, had shown me where. He thinks I know where it is. He wants it. And, her hand tightened on the locket. He wants me gone, permanently. To cover it all. Silas absorbed this, the pieces shifting but still not fitting cleanly. Gold, greed, murder. It was a darker tale than debts, explaining the relentless pursuit. But the note, who's J? He repeated. Someone helping you. Eleanor shook her head, bewildered. I don't know, I swear. Maybe someone who knew Silas, knew what Franklin was. Hope warred with terror in her eyes. Is it a friend? Silas thought of the unfamiliar handwriting, the risky delivery. A friend, or someone with their own stake in this. He was about to press further, when Abigail stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Eleanor instinctively pulled her closer, the shawl slipping slightly. The lights, Silas said abruptly, remembering the riders. He moved back to the shuttered window, easing the latch. He peered out. The ridge to the south was dark. The lanterns were gone. Had they moved on, or were they moving closer, dousing their lights to approach unseen? The vast moonlit prairie suddenly felt like a hunting ground, the silence more menacing than the earlier hoofbeats. He scanned the near distance, the creek bank, the approach to the barn. Nothing. Then, his eyes caught movement near the corral gate. Not a man, an animal. No, something small and dark lay on the ground just inside the corral entrance, something that hadn't been there before. It looked like a bundle of cloth, or perhaps a leather pouch. Silas stared, a fresh wave of cold dread washing over him. First the note, now this. While he'd been inside, confronting Eleanor, someone had been at the corral, leaving another message, or something worse. The unseen hand was moving closer, its intention still shrouded, tightening the noose around the isolated ranch. The riders might have vanished, but the danger hadn't. It was laying gifts at his doorstep. The leather pouch lying near the corral gate seemed to pulse with silent menace in the moonlight. Silas Morgan's grip tightened on the Sharp's rifle. Another message. Another ghost moving unseen. The riders might have vanished from the ridge, but this felt more intimate, more invasive. He scanned the surrounding darkness, the wind sighing through the grass the only sound. Whoever left it was gone, swallowed by the vast night. Cautiously, rifle ready, Silas crossed the open ground. He nudged the pouch with his boot. It was small, made of worn, oiled leather, the kind used for carrying precious tools or documents. No trap sprung. He scooped it up, the leather cool and smooth, and retreated swiftly back to the cabin's relative safety. Inside, Eleanor stood by the shuttered window, Abigail now awake and clinging to her hand, Martha's blue shawl still draped around the child's shoulders. Their faces were pale canvases of fear in the low lantern light. Silas held up the pouch. Found this, at the corral. Eleanor flinched, her hand flying to her hidden locket. What is it? Don't know yet. Silas moved to the table, the worn wood scarred by years and grief. He set the rifle down, but kept it close. With stiff fingers, he untied the leather thong securing the pouch and tipped its contents onto the table. A small folded piece of paper fluttered out, along with a heavy tarnished brass key. Silas unfolded the paper. The same jagged scrawl as the warning note met his eyes. Silas. Proof against Franklin. Deed to the claim Silas Vance found, registered in his name alone. Found it hidden in Vance's saddlebag after Franklin dealt with him. Took it to keep it safe. Knew Franklin would gut the place looking. Couldn't speak up then. Too scared. Name's Jedediah, worked for Vance. Saw what Franklin did. Got clear. Heard he was hunting Eleanor. Knew she'd head for open country. Remembered you from Vance talking about his cousin Silas out Montana way. Figured she might find you, or you might be the only one stubborn enough to hold this ground. The keys to Vance's strongbox back in Laramie. Deeds inside. It's hers. Get her to a sheriff with this. Franklin's claim is dung. Stay wary. He's got men, but this breaks his teeth. Jedediah. Silence hung thick in the cabin. Silas read the note again, then handed it wordlessly to Eleanor. Her hands trembled as she took it. She scanned the lines, her breath catching at her husband's name. Silas Vance. Cousins. That explained the shared name, the faint echo Jedediah had remembered. Tears welled in her eyes, not just of fear now, but of a dawning fragile vindication. Jedediah, she whispered, recognition flickering. He was loyal, quiet, disappeared after Silas died. She touched the key, cold and heavy. Proof, legal proof that the claim was her husband's, hers now. Franklin's entire pursuit, his violence was built on sand. The relief that washed over her was so profound her knees buckled slightly. She sank onto the bench by the table, pulling Abigail onto her lap, burying her face in the child's hair wrapped in Martha's shawl. Silas watched them. The puzzle pieces clicked. Vance talking about his cousin Silas Morgan. Jedediah, burdened by witness and fear, stealing the deed to protect it. Hearing of Eleanor's flight, and gambling on sending her towards the one man he hoped could stand against Franklin. It was a threadbare lifeline, spun from desperation and memory, but it had held. He thought of Jedediah, risking everything to leave the notes, the pouch, a flicker of decency in the darkness. The riders, Silas said, his voice low but steady. They were looking, but they didn't come down. Maybe saw the place wasn't easy pickings. Maybe Jedediah's warning spooked them off, or they're just scouts. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes meeting his, filled with a hope so raw it hurt. This, he tapped the deed note, changes everything. Franklin's got no legal leg. A sheriff sees this. He's the one running. Eleanor nodded, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. We can go? To Laramie. Get the strongbox. The thought of the journey, of facing the past was daunting, but the weight of being prey was lifting. Silas looked around the cabin, the cold hearth now warming with their presence, the empty rocking chair, the mantel with Martha's tintype. He looked at Abigail, her wide eyes watching him, trusting, nestled against her mother, wrapped in the shawl that had finally found comfort again. 3 years of silence, 3 years of dust. Then, a knock. "You ain't going alone," Silas stated, the words firm, final. Franklin might still try something stupid. "I'll ride with you. See this through." It was more than duty. It was a choice, a turning away from the monument of loss towards the fragile, demanding warmth of the living. Eleanor's breath caught. "Mr. Morgan, Silas, we couldn't ask." "You didn't ask," he said, a ghost of something almost like warmth touching his gravelly voice. "Jedediah sent you here. Maybe it wasn't just for the deed." He glanced again at Abigail, at the shawl, at the cabin that suddenly felt less like a tomb, and more like shelter. Place could use a cook, permanently, and, he hesitated, the words unfamiliar, rusty, a child's laughter. A sob escaped Eleanor, this time of pure, unadulterated relief and gratitude. Abigail, sensing the shift, the easing of the terrible tension, wriggled off her mother's lap. She walked over to Silas, her small face serious. She held out her ragged cloth doll. "For you," she whispered. "So you ain't lonely no more." Silas stared at the offered doll, a symbol of pure, trusting innocence. Slowly, reverently, he took it. The rough fabric, the button eyes, felt alien in his calloused hand, yet it anchored him to the present, to this small fierce light in the darkness. "Thank you, Abigail," he murmured, his voice thick. I reckon that'll help." Outside, the wind still sighed across the endless prairie. The threat wasn't entirely gone. Franklin still existed, a shadow on the horizon. But within the walls of the Broken Wheel Ranch, a different kind of strength had taken root. Silas Morgan, the widowed cowboy, looked at the woman who had knocked on his door, and the child who had offered him her doll. He saw the deed on the table, the key to justice, and the faintest hint of pink beginning to bleed into the eastern sky beyond the window. Dawn was breaking, not just on a new day, but on the fragile, determined beginnings of a chosen family, forged in the crucible of loss, and found in the vast, unexpected mercy of the Wild West. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the quiet, resilient beat of hope.